My phone literally exploded, and that's going to be our headline question this week. Changes in our personal lives since getting into privacy, breaking down threat modeling, our thoughts on services that break TLS, end-to-end Slack alternatives, and dedicated IP addresses, end-to-end encrypted Slack alternatives. So welcome to the Q&A for episode 195, where we answer questions from our amazing patrons who allow us to make this podcast for all of you. You can view and join the questions on patreon.com/surveillancepod. We're going to jump into the first question, which comes from Rasta and is aimed at me. Nate, how are you liking the Pixel 8a after a few days if you've already picked that up? And what OS and regular apps do each of y'all run or use on mobile daily? So for those who do not follow me on Mastodon or are not in the patron chat, which you can get access to for $5 a month, where you can ask one of these questions and also get pictures like the one you're probably seeing on the screen right now, my phone literally exploded, and that was not fun. I was asleep. Thankfully, my wife was awake and came and woke me up, and she was like, "Babe, your phone exploded." And I thought she was exaggerating. I was still kind of waking up. But anyways, yeah, did not get a lot of sleep that night. So I had a Pixel 6a that I was running a custom OS on. I'm most likely going to get the 8a because, first of all, I'm not a power user for phones. I don't need like a super great camera. I don't need tons of processing power, tons of storaging space. I use my phone for podcast, music, Signal, phone calls, occasionally some notes, and I guess we'll talk about this more in a minute, but I'm just not a power user. So I'm great with the budget models. I like the iPhone SE. I like the Pixel A series. You know, it's like $500. Money's a little tight right now, which is why I have not picked up the phone. We just took our cats to the vet, and that ended up being twice as much as what I had budgeted for. Life is what it is. So I'm exploring some options. Right now, I've actually written a blog about this. My mother years ago sent me a little Motorola phone that was compatible with Lineage. And I was like, hey, before I buy a Pixel and potentially brick it, she literally just emailed me and was like, hey, I have these phones laying around. Do you have any use for them? And I was like, again, I looked it up and I was like, oh, this one's compatible. Go ahead and send me that. And then if I brick it, it doesn't matter. And here we are. And it's still going strong. So I had that laying around and I was like, well, I guess this is my phone now. I'll probably write a blog post about this because for the most part, most of my stuff was backed up. So I didn't really lose anything too severe. This phone sucks, to be clear. And it's not Lineage. I don't think it's Lineage's fault. It's just a really old phone. I think it stopped getting updates on like Android 9 or something. And it's just not very powerful. Like literally, if I'm in Brave and I get a Signal message and I click on it and I check Signal and I come back to Brave, Brave has refreshed and erased the page, which is incredibly annoying. But I'm mostly signed into all my daily use apps. And it's like, I'm at the point now where I'm like, I can at least make it until Black Friday. The 8A is plenty of foam for me. It's very cheap. The difference between the 8A and the 9 is so short that as far as like life support and getting security updates, it's not really worth getting the 9. That's just kind of my thought process. Right now, the big thing is I'm trying to balance budget and what can I afford and how am I going to do this? And I've got a couple options still that I'm just trying to settle on. In answer to your question, what OS and regular apps? I do use a custom OS. I'm going to cop out a little bit here and say I don't see a point in answering this question. No matter what OS I say, somebody's going to say, why don't you use a different one for whatever reasons? As far as regular apps, I use Signal like crazy. I use a lot of Signal. I use AntennaPod because I'm a big podcast listener. I do use Apple Music because I like streaming. I like being able to discover new releases. And I think Apple is among the most privacy friendly out there. There may actually be better ones, but Apple's up there. I use Libby for audiobooks. Let's see. I have a calorie counting app. I use Duolingo, which I think I haven't done today. I have my calendar, which is linked to Nextcloud. I have Nextcloud News that I use for the news feed. Like I said, I'm not a power user. I'm pretty straightforward. And I have other apps for the occasional times I need them. I use them often enough that it justifies having them, but I don't use them often enough that it justifies, like I wouldn't mention them as a daily thing. But yeah, those are, on any given day, I probably use those apps at least once. Long answer, but there you go. There's the story for everybody who's missed the drama that's going on in Nate's life. And by the way, I can definitely justify part of a phone as a business expense. So please donate if you sympathize.
None of the phones I have access to blew up, so I have a couple more options than Nate for OSs at the moment. I just made this iOS versus Android video, like a week or two ago? And I think that a lot of it comes from my personal experiences and the things I really enjoy about both platforms. And so I've kind of done a really nice little workflow in my life where I've integrated both operating systems within my life in very unique ways, and actually a few different ones, because there's iOS, there's stock Android, and then there's Fairphone with custom OS on it as well. Yeah, I would just say find the right operating system for you. Honestly, it doesn't really change the apps you can use for the most part. And I think the apps you use are in a lot of ways more important than the OS that it's running on, mainly because an OS won't guarantee you safe communication. If you're using an unsafe messenger, it won't guarantee you a safe browsing experience. It won't guarantee you safe networking from your phone. If you're not using like HTTPS and you're not, using a VPN on certain websites. So there's just a lot more things above the OS. And I think that people might give a little bit too much credit for the OS. But the fact there are OS options is still really solid. And there are still like underground benefits between different operating systems. And then regular apps, I don't know. I always think I use my phone too much, and then I'll like talk to other people, or I see other people, or I listen to podcasts that are tech podcasts that are like actual, like really into tech people, and they complain about their like iPhone 15 Pro Max battery life because it only gets them through half the day. And I go, whoa. Yeah, no, I don't use my phone very much. Like the phone that's most commonly in my pocket, because it actually is meant to fit in my pocket, is the iPhone 13 mini. And notoriously, the mini series has an awful battery life. At least that's what everyone says online. And the phone consistently gets me through like a day, day and a half. But I think it's because I just don't really use it much. So for me, Signal, a browser, I have a calendar, and I have Todoist. I just love Todoist. It's something that like can never escape my workflow. It's how I get everything done. Everything for Techlore, everything for surveillance support, everything for my work at Cake Wallet, everything goes into Todoist. And it's how I'm able to stay on top of just so many things at the same time. And my personal life, and then people in my life, keeping track of like just what I do on a day-to-day basis. That's how I do it. And then everything beyond that, like Nate said, just kind of like random things that I have on my phone, but those are like the core things I need. Oh, and then a password manager, Proton Pass. So yeah. Next question is from Only Exception, and they ask, what changes have you noticed in your personal lives since both of you have taken the privacy route? What have been the major pros and cons? And they say they're early on in their journey and they want to know what to expect. They say masters, and that's really nice, and I really appreciate that. But we're still evolving our journeys every single day. We got a head start maybe relative to you, but that's all we got. It's just a head start. So everybody, you're going to go through the same journey, and then there's a journey ahead of us that neither of us know what's ahead of us. So that's what I'll start with. And on my end, I'd say what I've noticed is a much more thoughtful relationship with the technology in my life. Before, I thought a little bit more about how technology worked, the kind of data that was collected, how it's there permanently on the internet. I think it was a lot easier to get excited for every new thing that companies announced, for every new technology, for every product that hit the shelves. It's something that I wanted, and I was like, wow, imagine this. This is going to make my life more efficient or more convenient in these following ways. But I wouldn't even think that far ahead of it. It just sounded cool. And I think once you start really understanding how these technologies work and more of the darker side of a lot of the technologies, at least on my end, I've learned to develop a much more cynical relationship with the technologies I integrate into my life, where I try to keep it as minimal as possible. Like my day-to-day workflow overall is just it's just exactly what I need. Nothing more, nothing less. And it allows me to just have a much more focused relationship with tech. My days are better, they're happier, and I feel just like a better human when I spend less time in front of a screen. And I feel like that's something that can resonate with a lot of people. So I'd say like the biggest notice I've changed in my personal life is just seeing the much more cynical side of technology, and seeing like friends of mine who are on TikTok all day and they're always complaining about how sad they are. And you can't really tell them to stop going on TikTok, but I know a lot of people really enjoy TikTok, but I feel like screen time is just not compatible with like general happiness. At least for me. Maybe other people have different experiences. So cons are just, sometimes it's inconvenient for me. I'm trying to open an account and they're like, we can't verify this info because XYZ. I never know why they can't verify it. So it's super inconvenient there. I can't integrate things that would make my life easier and more convenient. Like I've been wanting a robot vacuum in my house because it's hard to keep up with a pet. And I have been doing research the last couple of weeks, and there isn't a single workflow that balances, because you can like flash this custom OS on And I'm like, no, I'm not going to be dealing with a freaking custom OS robot vacuum. There's this like awkward
That
middle
sounds
ground
like too
right
much
now.
even for me.
Yeah, so it's just not an option. Like I can't get a robot vacuum because none of them actually fall within the criteria of me owning, especially an IoT device like that. So I'd say those are the cons for me, is just the inconvenience of that. And then there's some other issues too. Like I can't register certain things to where I live, which make certain areas of my life really difficult as well. There's a lot of like inconveniences, I think.
Yeah, I think the pros for me. So the first biggest one that I noticed was, and this is something I preach to everyone, is like my interactions with all my friends became so much more meaningful. My sister had her first child. I don't have a Facebook, and she still goes out of her way. We have a group chat, me, my sister, her husband, and my wife, and she still will send photos and videos of her child to the group chat. And I had Facebook. Like, this would surprise you guys. I was that tool, no offense to those people, who put everything on Facebook. Like, in the profile where it's like, what's your address? What's your phone number? What's your favorite quote? Like, I filled all that crap out. I'm not kidding. That's one of the reasons that I'm so militant about privacy, is like, if I can do it, you can do it. Number two, it's like, I know what I'm talking about. Like, it is so much more meaningful for her to send that, even though it's a group chat with 4 people in it, it's still more meaningful that it's like, you took the time to think about me and message me. And even just like the random, hey, how are you doing? How have you been? We haven't talked in a while. Like, same thing. You thought about me and you engaged me directly, instead of like, let's be real. When you get a like on your post and you get that little dopamine hit, we all know what it means. I'm laying in bed or sitting on the toilet or somewhere where I'm bored and I'm cruising Facebook. Like, it actually goes back to what you were saying a minute ago about like people in the relationships to their phones. When people find out I'm into privacy, they're always like, oh yeah, I don't really use Facebook that much. I just use it for like, talking to a couple family members. But then every time I look at them, like if we're waiting for the elevator or like it's first thing in the morning and we're waiting for the computers to load up, like I look over at them and they're sitting there on their phones just scrolling Facebook. I can see it on their phones. They're on Facebook every time, every single time. It's like, you use Facebook so much more than you think you do. Oh God, what was the second one? It's something recent. Oh, so recently, like within the last year or so, twice I've been forced to engage with mainstream platforms. These are both going to make me such a hypocrite because these are my top 2 hated companies. I bought this camera actually on Amazon because we shared this a couple weeks ago. I tried to buy it on B&H Photo, and they were like super militant about like, no, you have to use a real credit card. And I was like, go kick rocks. It's half the price on Amazon. When we're talking the $1,600 camera, it's half the price on Amazon, and they don't give a crap as long as the check clears. So I bought a couple things on Amazon. And then recently with this whole phone situation, one of my friends was like, hey, why don't you check out Facebook Marketplace? I know you hate Facebook, and I've heard literally nothing but good things about Facebook Marketplace. I've heard multiple people be like, it's the only good thing left about Facebook. Y'all, I typed in Pixel 8a. I got iPhones, I got Samsungs, I got Huawei's, I got Pixel 9s. At least those are like somewhat in the range. I got Pixel 7s. And I even clicked a couple of these ads because I'm like, are these people who are just like stuffing the ad with keywords to show up in search? No, it was a totally normal ad. It's like, I'm selling a Samsung Galaxy S22 for this much money. Hit me up if you're interested. I'm in this area of town. And I'm just like, it's text search, Facebook. How are you this bad at text search? And so that's like my other thing, is every time I'm forced to interact with a mainstream platform, I'm just like, are you that deep in the Stockholm syndrome that you don't realize how objectively bad? It's objectively bad. Like, I cannot impress upon you guys, it's objectively bad. Everything about mainstream tech, like once you've disengaged for a while and you come back to it, it's like, this is an objectively bad experience. And I'm telling you, this is not a privacy thing. This is not a FOSS thing. This is a, like, as someone who stepped away for a minute and is now like forced to come back every once in a while, it is objectively bad. I'm sorry. I know I've been ranting, but like, those are the 2 big things I've noticed. My interactions are more meaningful, and like mainstream software is just turning into a garbage pile. As far as cons, I mean, I think news is probably the biggest thing I struggle with. I do listen to a daily news podcast, so I feel a little bit more engaged. But even so, there's a lot of times that my coworkers will be like, hey, did you hear about this thing? Or did you see this story? And I haven't. Admittedly, I did lose a lot of friends. When I deleted Facebook, there were a lot of people who just chose not to keep in touch. Some of them I reached out to directly and I was like, here's my phone number. Never heard from them again. I think it's harder, especially as a music fan, it's harder to keep in touch with like new bands, new concerts. Again, I do use streaming, so I do have some new recommendations, but they're not always local bands. I don't know what local bands are up and coming. It's harder to network because I don't have like LinkedIn and stuff like that. I think overall I'm happier. I think it's worth it. Our next question comes from Apricot. Threat modeling. I can imagine an outsider to privacy and security drawing a mental blank when they hear this. Understanding threat modeling is important, though, because there is no single solution that works for everyone's situation. For someone starting on the privacy and security journey, can you please give a brief summary of threat modeling? Can you provide some examples of how a person does it? Particularly, they were asking if we could cover two very different examples, a parent versus a journalist. Personal examples, if any come to mind, wanting to make this abstract term a bit more concrete and approachable. Please and thank you. So first off, I do have a whole page on threat modeling on my website, thenewoil.org. I draw heavily from EFF's own security self-defense page, which is linked at the bottom, and privacyguides.org also has a whole page about threat modeling, so definitely check those out if you haven't. Can you please give a brief summary of threat modeling? What are you trying to protect and who are you trying to protect it from? That is my, like, in a nutshell summary of threat modeling. Kerry Parker also has in his book a fantastic example towards the beginning, because, you know, the whole premise of his book, for those who don't know, is like he tries to do a lot of nerdy references and just appeal to the nerd culture. So definitely check that out if you're a nerd. And he uses the example of a medieval kingdom. He's like, the king has decided to make you a ruler, a lord of this land. You have to defend it. Well, you only have so many resources. You still have to allow trade in and out of the kingdom. You can't just cut off everybody. You have to take into account all these different factors. I think the biggest misconception with threat modeling is that there is a threat model, because I think there's different threat models for different situations. Sometimes you're willing to share a little more. Sometimes you're willing to share a little less. If I'm meeting a friend, like I'm making a new friend, I'm probably going to give them my real name or, you know, tell them what area of town I live in. I'm not telling you any of that on the internet.
Yeah, I won't add too much here. I'll just say, like, a quick example is going to be on my end, like Techlore in itself kind of has its own threat model. Very little to no privacy. It's a public thing. We post public YouTube videos. My face is on the videos. I'm behind it. And it's a formal business, but it's completely compartmentalized from me behind the scenes, at least as much as I realistically can. And again, like for Techlore, it's all about security. So it's services that can provide the utmost security because it has such a public scene. It pretty much exposes us to a lot of security issues. And that's what I'm a lot more concerned about in the Techlore side of things. Whereas in my personal life, I care a lot more about maybe a nice combination of privacy and security. I don't want a lot about my personal life getting out there. And the thing I'm trying to protect is making sure that I can have realistic privacy in my day-to-day life. And I don't have to be concerned about the kind of situations that can arise that you see online of people who maybe share too much about their personal lives and then they kind of regret the repercussions of that, especially when you have any kind of public following. So even within your own life, I know you say mother versus a journalist, but who says that a journalist isn't a mother, right? Like, it can be the same person. And that's what I'd be thinking about as well, just on top of everything that Nate said. Just ask yourself, like, why am I protecting this in this area of my life? And what do I need to do to deal with that one problem? What you want to avoid, and the reason for threat modeling, is just making blatant improvements across the board, because that's not sustainable. And you're probably going to prioritize the wrong stuff. And it's going to waste time, it's going to waste money, and it's going to make your life way too inconvenient. And the final question is a 3-part question. I think we're going pretty long today. My computer is officially migrated to dark mode. That is the way to do it. You do a system theme where your computer stays in light mode during the day, and then once the sun has set, then it's night mode. You'll never tell me that's not the right way to do it. Anyway, how do you protect yourselves against various tech that break SSL and TLS, like Cloudflare antiviruses into Kazakhstan attempting to become their own central authority? First off, I think that most of these things you have to do to yourself. Like an antivirus, you have to install an antivirus to do this. And in that case, it's kind of a trade-off you're going to have to decide on your own if it's worth doing. And I don't know exactly what you're referencing to with Cloudflare, but I assume it's setting up Cloudflare on a website and having them proxy it for you, ? I don't know if that's what you're referring to. But either way, a lot of these things are opt-in. And Kazakhstan is a bit of a edge case. There are a few countries that are trying to intercept all web traffic by requiring their own certificates to be used on everybody's devices. So they are essentially man in the middling all web traffic. that is, again, an edge case. So for someone where I am, where I'm in a country where this is not a concern, I'm not using Cloudflare or my antivirus in these ways, that's how I protect myself against these technologies in the first place. I don't know if there's a specific technology you're asking about that I'm not familiar with, so definitely let me know if I missed something and we can follow up next week.
So the first question, the only thing I have to add, David mentions in the longer version of the post, the whole Cloudflare thing. A lot of people will argue that Cloudflare does break the encryption between the server and the connection, which is true. And I know because I'm using Cloudflare Tunnel on my Jellyfin server so that we can access it when I travel and stuff. You can set it up in such a way where it bypasses Cloudflare. Like I can still use the tunnel, but it'll basically allow me to go right through it. But it's much easier to just say, hey, Cloudflare, just do your thing and get in the middle. So I guess by default, it doesn't have to break SSL, but it depends on how the server has set it up. And because Cloudflare is so ubiquitous, which is really my bigger concern with Cloudflare, I'm not so concerned about them from a privacy perspective. I'm more concerned about them from the fact of like they pushed an update and killed a third of the internet one time. Actually, I think they did it like 3 times, at least twice, that I'm sure of. So that's more what concerns me is that level of centralization. Like it happened at CrowdStrike and all of a sudden the government was like, we should do something about this. And it's like, cool, it's only happened like 3 times before. But either way, it's like, cool, I'm glad we're waking up. Maybe we shouldn't do this. But anyways, that's a different rant.
It's the pro and con of Cloudflare. It's also the reason why Cloudflare is one of the best censorship resistant tools because the whole internet's dependent on it. So in countries where they're trying to block websites, they literally can't if you're using something like Cloudflare, depending on how you configure it. So it's actually a really important censorship resistant tool.
I didn't know that. That's funny. I think a lot of it is stuff that you can just choose not to use. But in situations where you have no choice, I mean, the best you can do is contact the company and be like, I'm not using your service because of this reason. Like, I'm not mad. I just wanted to let you know. And if enough people do that, maybe they'll stop doing it. But I think it's also just a threat modeling thing, which I will actually come back to in the last part.
As for best end-to-end encrypted zero-knowledge alternative, in my opinion, because I was just looking for one for Techlore, there is none. That's my answer. That is my conclusion. There's Rocket Chat, which is just based on Matrix, to my knowledge, and I wasn't really a huge fan of it when I tested it a few years ago. I'm sure it's improved since then, but still not fantastic. I know there's things that you can host on your own, but you have to host them on your own, and I'm not a huge fan of doing that for something that's probably used for like something that needs a lot of reliability, given it's for Teams. So I did play around with like Synology Chats, I believe it's called, because we already use the Synology box for most of the Techlore workflow, and it also was not great. So on the Techlore front, we've been trying out Matrix lately, but it's not end-to-end encrypted nor zero knowledge by any stretch of the imagination.
By default, only one-to-one DMs or one-to-one DMs that you then add more people to are encrypted. If you make like a public room, even if you restrict the invites, it's not encrypted by default. You have to enable encryption.
Yeah, and which we did. So again, it's misleading. Like what I said is a little bit misleading. I just think it's not, the way Matrix works is just not very zero knowledge. Like the home server, even with encryption, sees so much about every user, and it's just not going to have the kind of protections you're probably looking for. That's something like Signal is going to offer you, or a lot of other privacy-focused messengers. So yeah, I'd love to see someone do it, because I haven't actually seen something that balances the usability of things like Slack and Teams and the power of those tools with the privacy. If someone wants to build one, let us know.
I agree. The first thing that came to mind for me was Matrix, which I do like Matrix, but I will be the first to admit it also does have some shortcomings. It is very buggy, especially if you enable encryption on larger rooms. There's some rooms I'm in that are encrypted, and it's not uncommon for somebody to be like, hey, I can't read your message, unable to decrypt, and somebody else will have to screenshot it and share it so that that person can see it. There's a lot of federation issues like that. There's a lot of little bugs. I don't know if I would trust it for something like a business. I've always been interested in trying out Nextcloud Talk, but I'm pretty much the only one using my server, so I haven't had a chance to do that. I see where Henry's coming from with like not everybody wants to manage an on-prem solution. So things like Nextcloud and Synology are not necessarily right for everyone. Like Henry said, if somebody wants to make a good option, there's definitely a market for it, but I don't think one currently exists.
And then the last thing, do you know of a reputable and audited VPN provider that does dedicated IP addresses? So I'm not super familiar with dedicated IP addresses, but I did do a quick search, and it's really hard to sort through the BS, which is the VPN search of any web browser or any search engine. I did pull up a little blog here, and so of the options, Proton VPN does have it, but like they allude to, it's behind the business plan. So you're going to have to pay up quite a bit if you want to get it through Proton. Of the services that actually offer this, none of them seem great. But PIA seems like one of the lesser bad ones, mainly because they're open source, they've done consistent audits. And I guess, but if that's your only requirement, then even some of these other services might do that. I don't know. I'm not as familiar with this as I should be. One other option to throw your way is Windscribe. Windscribe does not do dedicated IP addresses because, as they say, they don't do it for privacy reasons, which is a good reminder that dedicated IP addresses have some privacy concerns. But when it comes to Windscribe, they offer a static IP, which at least guarantees you the same IP address every time. And they also have the option for residential IPs. So depending on what you need your dedicated IP address for, you might be able to use the static IP feature from Windscribe to kind of accomplish most of what you need. That's just one other option. And Windscribe is open source and audited.
Same thing as Henry. I was going to mention PIA is recommended by Michael Basil. You say, do you think it's worth getting? That one I kind of do want to weigh in on. That goes back to threat modeling. I think they're very expensive. I don't know if you want to pay for that. I personally don't think they're worth getting. In my opinion, if I'm the only one using an IP address, I don't see the point of a VPN. You do mention that you still do get the protection from like your ISP and stuff, which I think is a fair point. But the vast majority of services I use, if they are VPN hostile, they're usually services that already know everything about me anyways, and therefore I don't care. But when they're not, like Reddit is getting insanely hostile to everything lately. Like not just VPN, just everything. Reddit is just point blank hostile. No caveats. Trying to log into Reddit, I swear to God, I could like, I don't know, I could get an ID in another state easier than I can get into Reddit most days. So stuff like that, a lot of the time I'm just like, I'll circle back later. Like when you get off your BS and you stop being difficult, because sometimes I log right in and it's like, boom, you're in, welcome. And then other times it's just like, no, we need 6 forms of identification, a blood test. I'll circle back in an hour. You're Reddit. I'm not going to die. Again, threat modeling. Is it worth it? Maybe it is for you. I don't know your situation. I don't know how much money you have. I personally wouldn't do it, but your call. All right, so those were our questions this week. Just some kind of insight into our phones and my phone situation. Thanks for those who joined on that. The changes we've noticed in our lives since getting into privacy, kind of simplifying and explaining threat models, our thoughts on services that could potentially break TLS, end-to-end encrypted Slack alternatives, and dedicated IP addresses. So thank you guys for tuning in and asking questions. We really appreciate them, and we really appreciate your support. If you're not already on Patreon, you can join our Q&As by joining Patreon at the link below, patreon.com/surveillancepod. We do appreciate the recurring support. It definitely helps us plan for things better and keeps us going. So thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for asking questions, and tune in this weekend for the next episode of Surveillance Report. There it is. God, I hope the recording caught that. I'm keeping it in if it did.